I'm going to start this video off by saying something that you've probably heard a million times already. My playthrough of Elden Ring was without doubt one of my favorite gaming experiences of all time. It has been at least a couple of years since I was so captivated with a game, although the reasons behind that captivation do tend to land more on the narrative side of things than the combat. For those who aren't aware, I'm someone who plays games primarily for a combination of experiencing their stories and being immersed in their worlds. I enjoy gameplay for sure, but it isn't the main reason I play most of the time. I say this because I will be talking here about what I took away most from the experience, and that is the integration of lore, story details, and the setting at large. I had tons of fun fighting the bosses, and they definitely contributed a lot to my enjoyment, but I'll abstain and leave the combat discussion to folks more educated in and better at gameplay than me, and instead just sum things up by saying that my experiences with Soulsborne bosses are so unique and unbelievable that it's difficult to articulate what feelings they evoke in me. Similar to how I feel about Berserk, fighting these behemoths is like living out the abstract dreams I had of dark fantasy as a kid. It's stunning, and it's like FromSoft reached into my mind and plucked out monsters I had always dreamt about but never knew exactly what they looked like until now when designing these surreal, horrifying, fantastical things. And that continued into Elden Ring. But for some reason, I found myself more engaged with the themes, backstories, and lore associated with a lot of these bosses more with Elden Ring than I have with any other game from the series, apart from maybe Bloodborne. From the way the pattern of the music for the Godric battle changes and fights within itself to reflect the rough, inferiority complex-fueled grafts that he would apply onto himself to grasp royalty, to the almost therapeutic fight with the regal ancestor spirit that made me feel as if I was putting something deeply sacred to rest, I couldn't stop myself from gazing in wide-eyed wonder at everything here in the midst of all my deaths. And that applied basically everywhere. Is there a lot of recycling and reuse of enemies? Undoubtedly. Are there flaws throughout the game? Sure. But personally, I couldn't care less. These things rarely bothered me, and when they did, the negatives they posed were dwarfed by the overwhelming positives everywhere else. With a world in the lands between that is unparalleled in scope, with a supreme beauty in the aesthetics, integrative details, and interconnectedness, and with a general immersion, tone, and creativity in the setting only approached by the likes of Xenoblade Chronicles, Final Fantasy IX, Breath of the Wild, and Witcher 3, it's insane. Sometimes these landscapes are so gorgeous in their raw, imperfect, vast beauty that you just have to sit there and take it all in. And from there, the details of how this all came to be begin seeping through. More than anything else, Soulsborne games capture my soul through their exploration, worlds, and stories, and what they evoke in me. And it goes without saying that the way that FromSoftware games tell their stories is understandably divisive. They're vague, cryptic, and so subtle that you can play the entire game without having much more than an inkling about what the plot is even about. To understand these stories, you have to look deeply for them, make connections and inferences based on item descriptions and details in the world and script that are intentionally minimalistic. Either that, or you have to look up lore videos on YouTube. And obviously all of that isn't for everyone. But personally, I adore this, and have always had so much fun with this sort of storytelling, having devoted countless hours to making conclusions through the subtext in other Souls games, in Zelda, and even in Pokemon. All of which, in my opinion, share stylistic similarities in narrative presentation, believe it or not. Maybe check out my Zelda videos or my Pokemon setting series if you're interested in learning what I'm talking about. Now don't get me wrong, I love traditionally told stories that tend to be simpler and upfront with what they're conveying, but this style just scratches an itch for the story lover in me that adores trying to put these details together. And it's not like this is a homework assignment or anything. It's always done out of my own volition and drive to learn, as the game coaxes you into wanting to understand it. Of course, there are the bombastic fights and the epic lines from the bosses that you want to learn more about to provide more impact and context to their character, and that alone is enough. But for me, the biggest hook is how well the games, and most pertinently for this topic, Elden Ring, conveys tone. The opening cinematic lays foundations that provide context, but the in-game experience hooks you into wanting to learn more. As I found myself gazing up at the Erd Tree, slowly traveling across the beautiful landscape of Limgrave strewn with bits of rubble fallen down from Farum Azula, I felt sad and somewhat lonely. I listened to the low strings of the music that seemed to cry and lament the state of this setting and deeply pondered as to what led to this sorrowful yet hushed land. And that was enough for me to desire to learn all about what happened here. Just an integration of very simple but very effective storytelling beats. The visuals, the music, the overall tone, the bits of dialogue, and the scattered nature of civilization in this place. It all made me instantly wonder what on earth went down, why it looked like the remnants of a setting rather than a thriving one, what had caused this place to experience calamity. Of course, as we know, this is a land without death due to Marika forcibly removing it from the Elden Ring and hiding it, and with this detail we can place the formerly unplaceable feeling that pervades so many sections of this game. No one properly dies here. They come back after returning to the Erd Tree or resurrect shortly after dying in the case of Companions of Death and the Undead. And this leads to this constant feel of murky decay, particularly in Caelid but throughout the whole world. The lands between feels like a place that, while hushed, cannot know peace or rest, and this leads to this tone of rot appropriately. On top of the cliffs, gazing across Liurnia towards the Erd Tree, or looking to the great beyond in any number of locations, the world feels so crisp and beautiful and fresh that you feel like you can do anything. But eventually, it all returns back to that muck, that decay. Whether it be in one of the dungeons or castles headed by the corrupt, whether you find yourself navigating the strewn remnants of a mire of death, or whether we encounter a boss that is lamentable in one way or another, ascents are always followed by descents, and we're never given license to forget that this is a broken, fragmented, shattered, sad world. And yet, as I alluded to in referring to the scale, there is nonetheless immense beauty to lose ourselves in amidst the cruelty. The murky lows are very low, but the stretches where we can lose ourselves in this world are so high, and those contrasts are so effective in getting across what this land is like. High fantasy highlands, snowy mountains, horrifically quiet hilltops full of the frozen husks of giants, misty marshes containing the remnants of an old town, rich lush forests, remnants of civilizations past, relics of architecture making you wonder. Echoes of Martin's old Valyria through seeing the suspended dragon in the leveled capital of Leyndell. An ancient city seemingly stopped in time, surrounded by soaring dragons, a land of corpses, fire and blood, a feast for crows, scavenging the earth, armies of the dead dragging themselves all over the place. There is so much variability in the geography and mood, and yet they all pull off that very same effect I've been talking about, with the specifics of the story being pulled back so that you can just wonder. What happened? There was clearly some sort of big battle, but are these armies of the dead cursed here? Are they all soldiers or citizenry? What happened to this sunken town, and why was the academy closed off? What caused the giants to be decimated like this? The imagination takes the fore until you put these pieces together, and with remnants as rich and evocative as this, half the fun is in the imagining. But what stands clear above all else regardless of context is that there is profound serenity here, and we see it throughout. However, war has ravaged it and undercut it, such that there is much less than there should be. And even just describing it in these flashes is enough to get the idea across. The shattered Elden Ring, a land torn asunder. The remnants of this war of the shattering, Caelid overtaken by Melania's rot, Mikola stolen from the Hillig Tree's roots by his demented half-brother after trying to no avail to cure his and his sister's curses. Godric, the runt of the litter, hand-fistedly trying to become strong through the rudimentary addition of flesh. Morgoth, cursed but dedicated to the Golden Order. Rykard, so possessed by his blasphemy that he's become inhuman and adorned his mountain with corpses. Radahn, unrelenting in his madness, holding back the stars, almost begging to be put to the sword. Rennala, broken, cradling her egg and failing to reproduce the daughter she so misses. Godwyn, his body morphed beyond recognition to become the Prince of Death while Fortisax tragically fights without end to save its beloved companion to the point of corruption. Radagon, arguably the character that makes one wonder the most. Marika, whose wrath and desire is the progenitor of all. The Golden Order, possibly just as vile but in a different way. Melina and her quest that intersects with ours, and Ranni, refusing to submit and play a role in this farce. Miyazaki talks about how important it is to have human dignity in his bosses and antagonists, and in my opinion, that is key for establishing this wonder and intrigue and investment. With the dust settled, the stalemates established, and these demigods having taken up their places, this war-torn land is lonely and angry and mourning, as shown by the tragic and lamentable Song of the Bats, as they mourn the loss of their home and how the Golden Order has forsaken them. The common folk, which essentially amount to the non-gods with only a few exceptions, are left to pick up the pieces and fend for themselves, transformed internally or externally due to fear, vengeance, or any number of fantastical conditions. It's all horrifying and deeply sobering. And the things I describe here are again classic FromSoftware, to provide bits and have us make connections for ourselves. But the scope has never been this vast before. It's never felt quite this political and grand. This Game of Thrones-esque filial story of half-sibling gods fighting one another, this world whose very nature can be altered at a whim, leaving the denizens left behind and forgotten. From the sweeping to the minuscule, this game had me by the scruff of my neck. I've rarely been as awestruck as I was when I saw the Erdtree for the first time. I've never been as disturbed by a setting as I was by Caelid. I've never felt quite what I felt when I was transported to the crumbling Fair Missoula and set eyes on the ravaged ancient city, wondering how the hell this was going to play into the story. I would look around at the tiniest aspects, like the design of a classroom in the academy, or the barracks in a castle, to try and infer details there because I know that thought went into every nook and cranny of the environmental storytelling of this place, and just to promote immersion. The weight and sadness as the round table hold slowly emptied out and finally burnt to the ground as Hugh resolves to die, memory lost, in the place he said he was going to stay for his queen, comforted by the one soul who offered him solace, the one that he himself saved. The agony of Blythe, furious and confused and pained beyond belief at the idea that he could ever possibly do what was programmed into him. I could go on forever just naming characters or locations or little moments that made me feel, but I won't bore you more than I already have. I just really love this game. Not that it really matters, but at this very moment, I could not tell you whether I prefer Bloodborne or Elden Ring. I think Bloodborne is so unique in its progression and lore, which I'll talk about in an upcoming video, and I think that the mix of gothic and cosmic horror elements as we make our way throughout the game is something totally unique and unmatched. But there is such a draw to the familial politics and unbelievable scale of Elden Ring that just feels so grand in the amalgamation of integrative stories and ideas throughout its land that I can't really say that I prefer one over the other right now. But again, not that this even matters. Elden Ring was a phenomenal experience, and while I would never argue that it's perfect, at the end of the day it did all that I was hoping it would do for my experience and more, and I have no doubt that I'll be spending tons of time poring over more details and learning more about the lore so I can get as much as I can out of this story. I can only hope that you feel similarly to me, and I can only hope that you enjoyed it half as much as I did. Many thanks for watching.